Now, without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce today's first speaker, Mark Medowski, Vice President and leader of Ipsos Canada's Social Intelligence and Analytics team. Mark, you have the floor.
Thank you, Ellen. Before I turn my webcam off and get through the content, I do want to start off by thanking all of you for taking the time out of your busy schedules to be here today. But I don't think you're going to be disappointed. Today we're starting a new path, a new way of thinking about things, a new way of evolving and enhancing and modernizing the way that you look at insights. So with that being said, let's get started and get to the first big question that we all have lingering on our minds right now. So this question that I'm talking about what we're missing, it's a simple question, but it's one that's powerful in and of itself in this world that we are living in today. It's one that is becoming increasingly more and more difficult for us to answer as marketers. What are we missing? What is not coming out in the insights that we have? The rapidity of change that we are experiencing is making this more and more difficult for us to answer. What this is ultimately leading us to is FOMO. That fear of missing out. I'm sure a lot of us hear this one being used. We're all living in this FOMO world where we all want to make sure we're omnipresent in all of the right places, reaching all of the right people so that we have the best opportunity to scoop up as many dollars from consumers as possible. Social listening is one of those places we all experience FOMO. We all know we need to do it. Many of us do, but most of us don't know what to do with it. So here is where the challenge comes. How do we make sense of it all? How do we take social and survey-based insights and make them, while predicated on the same notion, sing to each other, even though they are fundamentally different from one another? If we think about social and we think about survey-based data, they're speaking different languages. I always like to think about it back to the old analogy of putting an engineer and a marketer in the same room together. They both have the same goal, sell product. When put in separate rooms, they'll figure out two different ways probably to sell those products. At surface glance, the marketer, they might take a route that's a little bit more emotional, tapping into the sentimentality of consumers. The engineer, they might take a little bit more of a rational route, try to show that consumer the product features, how it's going to make their life easier. Which is right? The answer is, as we all know, both are. But finding a way to harmonize and make both of those different outcomes sing together to provide an impactful way of doing things is a massive challenge for us. What our objective here and what our purpose is here at Ipsos is to answer this type of problem in question. This is the type of challenge we thrive upon here. And we've developed a system that we know will help you to better understand how to craft those insights from both social and survey-based data to provide impactful, strategic insights moving ahead. So what we're going to do with our time here together in the next 40 odd minutes or so is we're going to show you a few things. We're going to show you some data. We're going to show you some of our thinking, and we're going to show you a new way of tackling your business challenges. The first half of this presentation, I will show you some of what we're doing and how we're doing it with regards to social intelligence and using it to enhance survey-based research to fill in those gaps. Then I'm going to pass the mic over to my colleague Vijay, and he's going to give you a little bit of a look under the hood and show you the engine that actually drives a lot of those insights and our thinking. So with that being said, I hope everybody's ready to really understand these two languages of social and survey and how we are making them talk together as one here at Ipsos. I want to start off by talking about the potential of social data because it is enormous. I think many of us have had the experience, the opportunity to read this article from The Economist back in 2017 where the prediction was made that data would surpass oil as the most valuable commodity that this planet has to offer. Well, guess what? 3 years later, we've achieved that, and data has emerged as the most valuable commodity that this world has to offer. But here is where the challenge actually lies. How do we make sense of it all? There is so much data that is floating around via our actions, via our behaviors, via surveys that people take, via different types of activities that we engage in on a day-to-day basis. Here's an interesting statistic for you. 80% of all of that data that is floating around, it's unstructured. So that's non-survey based data that's just floating around in the universe. And again, it is being collected from our mobile devices. It's being collected based on the activities and the actions we take on a day-to-day basis, predicated on behaviors. It's a phenomenal amount of data that we're collecting, but more importantly, it has massive potential for us if we can understand how to harness it. Let's take a look at an example. Right here is some consumption data from the alcohol category, watching how consumption rates have grown. And as our astute Ipsos researcher would say from this slide here, category usage, it's increasing at rates we've never seen before. Really nice to see, okay? I don't see any peaks or valleys in here, a very slow yet consistent growth pattern. If I was a brand or a sales marketer here, I might just say to myself, best I make sure my product deployment plan is ratcheted up because there's a tsunami of sales that's about to come my way. But hold fast for a second. That's not where the story ends. It's important for us at all times to take a step back and ensure that we're really looking at the bigger picture from a more holistic lens. So let's take this data that you see on the left-hand side that we just showed on the previous slides, and now let's couple it together with some social intelligence. So on the right-hand side here, we see some social conversation just around alcohol during the last sort of 8 to 12 months or so here. And sure enough, early in the pandemic, we see the conversation for alcohol really positively moving upward. There's a lot of people who were talking about day drinking. They were having layoffs. There was people working from home, lighter workloads. And again, apparently a lot of you were talking about new rituals you were developing at home related to day drinking. Again, this marries up very nicely with what we see in terms of the consumption behavior. However, once we look deeper at the conversation, a bit of a different picture starts to emerge. A picture that's actually earlier in the pandemic, early in May, where people are starting to show concern. Day drinking is dangerous. It leads to addiction. It leads to other problems. What are we doing to prevent this and stop this? And slowly over time, you can see that the conversation starts to peter out a bit and it starts to drop off. And what it ultimately told us is it gave us the prescience to know that alcohol sales were likely going to start to drop over time before it actually happened. So social really helped us to see forward into the future by marrying it together with some of our consumption data from one of our tracking studies. So I know what you're asking now. How do we get there? How did we do this? Well, here at Ipsos, we merge the technology with people. There's a very specific reason that I refer to this as social intelligence and not social listening. In 2018, we acquired Synthesio, our own social intelligence platform in recognition of the changing tide of our industry and our need to better understand passive responses from consumers. We also recognized that we needed thought leaders to make sense of that information and help to make it more impactful for you, our clients. We found the easiest way to do this was by merging people with the right technology, and that's why we ensured that AI analytics were powering the technology that we were using to help to uncover and yield those insights, so we could deliver to you the most impactful and most forward-thinking insights in the most efficient way possible. Because one of the biggest challenges we have seen again and again and again in social is it's onerous. There is a lot of information out there. Having the ability to distill and find out what matters is what will give you an advantage in this market today. Our Synthesio platform offers us the ability to crawl the web like no others. And Vijay is going to walk us through the platform in a short while here to really give you a demonstration of what it's like. But not only through this platform do we have the ability to access a lot of the traditional social channels, but we have the ability to really go across a number of different digital sources to ensure that we're acquiring the best coverage and the highest quality, most representative conversation that is out there. It's not always just about making sure that we are scraping every single touch point out there that is making mention of everything. It's ensuring that there is quality and there's rigor behind those sources that we are scraping data from. What this allows us to do is better understand people in the moment. So when we have access to this social data, it allows us to really understand things that are happening as they are happening. I can't underscore the importance of this in this world, especially that we are living in today. Things change literally by the moment. From one evening to the next morning, you may have a different set of protocols that you need to follow in terms of your purchasing process. Maybe stores are all closed down now in your area as a result of COVID. Maybe they're not. Understanding the anxieties, understanding the confusions, and such as that are critical to understand in this market to be able to speak to our consumer in a way that is relevant to them. Social provides us this lens, and it does so in a very easy and very nimble manner via our platform. Survey-based data, I want to impress upon the group here, is still a fantastic and intrinsically critical part of the insights process. However, it does not always provide us that direct lens as to what is happening in the moment and help us to understand the exact language that the voice of the consumer is putting out to us and understanding those emotions attached to that. Once we take these two sources of data between the social and the survey and we integrate them together, we bring a very powerful set of potential insights to the table. It allows us to be more closely connected, to really understand how people are interacting with the brand in their own words, how they're experiencing it, how they perceive it as well. So we can really understand if there's disconnects between how they're talking about it and how they perceive it to be. Identifying those opportunities for future brand growth. So with the example I showed earlier of in the alcohol category, that helped us to sort of look ahead and identify an opportunity. Okay, where we need to pull back, maybe we need to get a little bit more D2C with our consumer base if they're going to be pulling back on their in-store shopping behaviors. Provide those early alerts because, again, especially in this market, we never know when things are going to change and how they're going to change. Being able to have the ability to get on top of that before we have to wait for the data to come to us via our survey research. This adds a valuable additional lens. It might help to even inform survey research as we go through. And most importantly, is it offers a very unique competitive lens to different activities that maybe our competition is moving through with, but also different disruptions and different things that are happening within our category, amongst our different brands, or just in the overall conversation in general. So again, there's lots of different avenues that we can use when we couple these two together, these two different types of research together to really understand how we can affect brand change. Where this ultimately turns us out to is a framework that allows us to help you to better understand that bigger picture that is so critical in this market that we're in today. Using the survey and the survey KPIs as that strong foundation by which we're understanding how our brand is, or maybe our product is, performing at a particular time, having those KPIs, then building a very bespoke and customized portal to that primary research that speaks exactly the same language can help us to understand from, again, a different lens, how the consumer is reacting and how they're speaking to those KPIs, with the net outcome of convergence into enhanced insights for our strategic planning moving into the future. So let's talk a little bit about how we actually do that. I want to really talk about how we crawl the conversation and how we get there. So a few more slides here, and then VJ is going to take over for his part and really show us exactly how we go about scraping it. But first thing I wanted to talk about is what this brings to the table for you. The power that social and survey, when brought together, bring to the table, because it is a very powerful notion. That social, when it is integrated with quantitative research, whether it be brand health, whether it be innovation research, whether it be some sort of ad hoc segmentation type work that you do, it can help us really understand what people are saying beyond their direct responses in survey data. How many times has a as a research point, come back and said, there are 50% of people who are proud to use your brand. That's really, a great piece to know. It's important to know that people are proud to use the brand. But what does that mean? What does it mean to people to be proud to use their brand? That's where social comes into play. And that's where it can really help us to uncover how people are talking about things in a much richer and more dynamic way. It can help us to understand how the activation is actually being spoken about. Are there any media spikes that we need to be sort of thinking about or listening into? What brands are getting momentum? It's not only us. Again, this can provide us a really valuable competitive lens. What can I learn from those competitors? So, okay, competitors are growing, they're gaining momentum. How? Why? What are people doing? What are people saying? And most importantly, what is the social brand identity for myself? One of these notions that many of us are starting to recognize in this digitized world that we live in is that we have two personalities, not only as people, but as brands. There is our virtual self and there's our real self. How do people and how do consumers who are coming out to build relationships with us, go out and purchase our products, how are they seeing the digital representation of our brands? Social can really help us to unpack that and uncover it in a very simple and streamlined fashion through the platform. As VJ will walk us through, the platform itself is based on a very simple design that's meant to make things as efficient as possible. We use artificial intelligence to pick up those trends as they're happening in the moment and actually pull out the insights for us so we can use that as an early detector when things are happening. It very much uses a BI style of reporting. So one-to-one, porting things over into social, into the reporting that you are used to and know and love. It's an easy transitional process. There's not a bunch of sitting down back and forth and an iteration that goes between this. We try to build the platform and design the platform to marry up and be as strategically aligned to our survey-based research as possible. We have a team that very much makes sure that that data and that conversation that is coming through, that it is meaningful, that we're not getting sort of random conversation that's not necessarily what we want to see. We have a lot of tools and different protocols in place that get rid of the junk, because there is a lot of junk that comes through in the social conversation. We want to make sure we're getting those nuggets that are actually valuable to us across these different social platforms that we have access to. And above and beyond, just looking at it on the big, again, social media platforms, the Facebook, the YouTube, and the Instagram, is making sure that we can look at it from a local perspective too, and across those local platforms, because they are important. We are, as a country, Canada, just one nation within a larger universe. So we want to be able to understand how people are talking about things in our market. As I've alluded to a few times, the automated insight is part of what makes our solution so wonderful here, is that it helps to dig out things as they're changing. If something smells a little bit different, the tool picks it out and it alerts us that there's something happening different. So we don't need to go in and take a search around and look around to say, hey, okay, there's something that might be here. We get notifications right away to know if things are happening so we can keep pace in the moment. And lastly, as I mentioned in this part here, is BI style reporting. It's very easily and transferable into other reporting. We're allowed to build KPI frameworks that align to your survey-based research. So again, these aren't just sort of very broad, blasé topics, as VJ will show you. We very much structure the topics and the different components that we're searching for to marry up to what you are doing in your survey-based research. So before I pass it over to VJ, the last piece I wanted to do is walk us through a little bit of a case study, because I know that it's always great for us to say, hey, we do this and we do it really well, but it's always nice to be able to see it visualized and in action. So I want to show us a little case study from the automotive world where we've taken this framework and we've applied it to Hyundai. And this comes from actually India. What we have seen here is that in India, just to maybe give everybody a little bit of background, the SUV market, it's a very competitive one. It's a big market in India, and it's one that new brands are constantly trying to break into and grab a bigger chunk of the share. Suzuki Brezza has typically held on to the largest portion of the share and they intended to hold on to this with a full model change that was coming up at the beginning of 2020. In the meantime, though, Hyundai came out with the Venue. And right away, as you can see, they made a bit of a splash in the markets and started to steal share away from Brezza. When we looked at some of our brand health KPIs, we did notice that Venue, it's making some noise and it was starting to grow. And it was starting to catch up really quickly to Suzuki Brezza, which still was the market leader. But again, those KPIs were starting to take a little bit of a different look than what Suzuki ideally would want to see, and obviously what Hyundai was happy to see here. When we actually looked at how the conversation was around the launch of the Venue, we can see that it had a very pronounced, and it got caught. And in terms of the discussion, not only did the initial announcement that it would be coming get a big spike, we saw some of that carry through right over to the actual launch of the Venue. When Brezza decided to come out with their model change, yes, it got a little bit of conversation, but it paled in comparison to what we had seen come out from the Venue itself. So what we were able to uncover from this is that Hyundai Venue, with the social media mentions that it had, it was able to hold on to people's attention for a much longer period of time. The creative itself was having obviously a more impactful engagement experience with consumers, because we can see here on the left-hand side, or the y-axis, that from an interaction standpoint, people were far more interactive with the actual Hyundai campaign in comparison to the Brezza one. We went a little bit further to really understand what people were saying, so Hyundai could understand, okay, what worked here, what can I do again in the future, what was maybe not working so well. As we sort of broke down what the conversation was saying, it was a lot about specific product features, which I can say is somewhat interesting, having worked in the automotive field in my past, and that usually people don't always talk about the very sort of rational features. They tend to talk about the experience and things like that. So the fact that not only were some of the new and unique features coming out for the Venue, but there was also, as you can see here, some promotions that were coming through. That they had related to some specific tactics and activations on the campaign launch. So the impact that we were able to deliver back to the client on this was, A, we were able to give Hyundai, the client, confidence that the success in the launch was apparent across not only their market share, but they were also starting to build more of an engagement response with their consumers, and they were getting more attention online. We were able to tell them that some of those memories of the car model, they actually were maintained and in turn converted into a growth in consideration and brand preference. And lastly, we were able to tell them what those positive mentions were that people really liked about the campaign and the product, talking about product features as specific strategies that they could use to differentiate themselves from the competition. Aspects that weren't necessarily just evident truths in and of themselves when looking at the brand health data. So this gives us a sense of how some of that conversation helped to really bring a richer analysis and more strategic insights to the forefront for Hyundai. So with that being said now, I'm going to pass the microphone over to my colleague Vijay, and he's going to walk us through how we actually get from A to B with the social intelligence platform.
Thanks, Mark. I'm going to show my screen in a second, but I just want to introduce myself. I am Vijay Ranganathan. I have worked at Synthesio prior to our acquisition by Ipsos a couple of years ago. So I've been at Synthesio for 7 years. And what I want to highlight and note, and maybe I'll turn my camera on so you can see me talking. What I want to highlight and note while I'm loading up the platform is a lot of what Mark was saying about the way that marketers approach product, maybe product design versus an engineer, very much applies to the way that Synthesio used to look at this data. And we used to always say, social data is a lens. It's a way to understand this. It sits alongside the surveys. It sits alongside everything else. And so what's really handy and really powerful for us is that being part of the family means that we can now say we have the survey data, and now we can also offer the platform. And one thing I want to add before I dive in, because we're going to see a lot of data, and one of the things that Mark kind of hinted at was 80% of the data is unstructured, and there is so much of this unsolicited, unstructured data that can really enhance our survey understanding and our brand health understanding out there, that data becomes an obsession for a lot of folks who are getting into the social intelligence game. And it becomes one of those things where people are obsessed with more and more and more. And one of the things that really I love personally about being part of the Ipsos family is that quantity is not nearly as important as quality. And to kind of put a fine point on that, IBM recently put out a study, and they found that bad data, bad data costs businesses $3.1 trillion annually. So we're talking about a huge impact that data quality and data understanding have. So if you're not actually really understanding that data well, what you're going to end up doing is having a lot of maybe information, but you don't actually have insight. And what Mark was talking about, and what I'm going to show you right now, is the way that we're trying to move to insight from this data, because it is, and in large part, overwhelming. So that's just something I want to highlight here. And I'm just going to pull up my screen and hope you can see it. And I'll give you a quick tour of our dashboard. Mark, can you just confirm you can see it all right?
I can see.
Okay, great. So what we have here is a Synthesio dashboard. And so Synthesio is that technology underlying the social intelligence work that we do here at Ipsos. A dashboard for us is really a data set. It's a project. It's where everything lives, and we can look at a lot of different things. So Mark was showing you the point of view of from the brand, so looking at Hyundai versus Suzuki. And what we can do is look at the way people communicate across the social web in many different ways. So it's not necessarily required to be linked to brand. So I can look at, say, coffee and understand the coffee conversations from the perspective of brand. You know, I am a retail coffee shop, the corner coffee shop, a chain store. I want to communicate this. I want to communicate to my customers, and I want to understand how they're talking to me. We can look at it from that brand perspective. And oftentimes and frequently, it is a key component of getting insight. However, the thing that we can do here is, you know, when we're doing more of that exploratory research for informing our understanding of brand health, we can flip the script a little bit and look at it from a really open-ended perspective where brand isn't as important. And in this case, we can ask those really broad, open-ended questions that you don't normally get to ask just purely from surveys. So, you know, surveys, you can ask a certain number of questions, but you know the longer the survey, the more people drop off. And luckily, with social, that's not the case. You can just ask more questions, and you know people are sharing that information. So here we have, for example, a view where we've put everything together based on different varieties of coffee, different aspects of coffee culture, different things, tools and implements people use to make coffee, where are they having it, and obviously thinking about COVID in this case, and then how they're making it, and of course how frequently people are having it. So these are just different things that I personally and my colleague, when we were building this, we were saying, okay, how would I approach this coffee topic, trying to understand it? So it can be a little bit more loose, a little bit more open-ended. And in keeping with that open-ended perspective, we were looking everywhere across the social web. You know, from those big core four that Mark was showing you on that little kind of long tail slide, all the way down to blogs and forums, and you know, even going into Sino Weibo and places around the world. So truly understanding a global viewpoint on coffee culture. And it's a really useful point of view because coffee culture, things migrate very quickly across borders. So Mark mentioned there are two major aspects to the Synthesio platform. And this is a platform that people use to do self-service consumption on top of real in-depth research. So we have teams and customers who use it directly, but we also are the starting point for our SIA colleagues, our Ipsos researchers, to dive in and find out more information. And the reason why this platform has evolved the way it has, and really emphasizing the AI, is in large part due to the types of questions people like Mark come to us with when they're saying, you know, I want to understand this, or you know, we're seeing the spike in conversation around the new Hyundai Venue. Is it real, or is it something less real, or you know, is it sustainable? These are the types of questions that led to the building of this Signals, our AI platform. So let me give you a tour of this. Here in the Signals section, we have a few different places to look at ways that people are changing the conversation about our topics. And that's a really important way to think of Signals. It's the way people are changing the way we think about these topics. So it's all organic. People are just commenting on whatever is happening. And it is AI powered. And what that means is what we've done is applied data science and learning models on top of just the fewer volumes of data that we're getting, and looking at how these things change. And specifically what we're looking for is trying to understand, and this is getting into the marketer versus engineer, getting into the process a little bit, how these changes are real versus maybe just part of the noise. Because as Mark mentioned, social data is huge and there's a lot of it, and it's often hard to see what's real and what's maybe just a temporary spike. And sometimes the line between the two is quite blurry. So I'm going to walk you through this very quickly, and I'm also going to show you a couple other things that help us enhance the brand health and survey insight that we try to get. So we're looking at a time period of 4 months. Personally, I specifically wanted to look at before and after the COVID spike. So nothing here is mentioning coronavirus, but it is looking at a time frame that we know is associated with coronavirus, and looking at a lot of these different topics that I've already shown you. So I'm looking at that 4-month period. And here in Signals, this is our homepage. I like to think of this as the place, you know, when you wake up in the morning on your phone, you have all your notifications and you kind of swipe them away if you don't need them, or click on them if you think it's useful. That's what this homepage is. It's the top signals. It's what you're going to have bubble to the surface first. And here you can start to see a few things, and these are being fed from our trends or context or engagement in our media wall. This is top things that you might want to look at. So I'm seeing instantly filter coffee had an increase between the end of February and the end of April. Well, no big surprise. Suddenly everyone's home. People are brewing their own coffee, but we can click in and find out more. So the point of the platform is to give you some assistance in trying to make sense and understand what people are saying. So we can see this shift. Now, the key thing about the shift is this is a normalized curve. So what that means is I'm here looking at this and saying, is this a flash in the pan? Is this a temporary spike? Or is this sustainable? Is this actually going to be, as we call it, a shift, a change in the fundamental way people talk about things? Even if it's maybe a medium-term change, is it a change? And here we can see that we had a before COVID, essentially, typical volume, and then a post-COVID typical volume that was a little bit higher. And if I go down and scroll, I can actually start to see, using all of the semantic analysis that we have, the things people are saying. And one of the things that's really fascinating to me is this word right here, mask. and masks. People are making face masks using coffee filters, especially early on when there was a sort of a shortage, especially here where I am in the US. And so we can instantly see there's some association during our time frame between face masks and coffee filter and filter coffee. So not something I would expect when looking at the coffee universe, but if I am in the space of understanding how people are talking about filter coffee, really important to me to impact my thinking. If I'm one of the companies selling filters, are these filters being sold for coffee or not? That's an important question to potentially answer. So here you go, you can see a lot of that same stuff, but you can also see something else. You see coronavirus there. You see a lot of people talking about staying at home. What we're seeing though is that a lot of that conversation is also moving. So that conversation is moving from your YouTube, where people are, essentially doing, how to make the perfect filter coffee, things like that, to your Twitters and your reviews and Reddit, where suddenly people are talking about, this is my life now. So we're moving from a place which is more of a publisher conversation platform to more of an interactive conversation platform. And this is the kind of thing that we would then dig into more and say, okay, let's find out more about that. Let's look at those mentions directly. So the point of Synthesio is to give you some assistance on understanding what's happening in the world. And with signals, we want to give you like the first top 5, top 10 things to look at. So when we're looking at these signals, I can see a few things that are coming up a lot. Now, let me walk you through really quickly our trends section, and I will then briefly touch on these others, and then we'll have some time at the end, maybe about 10 minutes for questions. Okay, so what we have here is our trends section. And in the trends, we have a few different ways of visualizing changes. This top one is very similar to the chart that Mark already showed. And it takes into account volume, how much people are talking about things on the x-axis, and velocity, change in conversation. And this is our way of just trying to roughly understand the where the conversation is landing and what's resonating, and more importantly, to the point of that Hyundai Suzuki example, what's not resonating. And so we look at things in terms of niche, which have low velocity and low volume, high potentials, high velocity, high change, but the volumes are still relatively low. Stars, where we have high for both, and then strongholds, where you don't have very much change in the volume, in the velocity, and in how much people are talking about it, but there is a very high volume. And so what we can look here at is a lot of different things, and what we do here on the right-hand side is we actually map the most significant changes. And this is going to be very important when I get to it in 1 second, because the significance of a change has to do with the volatility of the conversation. So I want to highlight, these are the top 5 or so significant trending topics. And I want to pause right here at home and dinner. And I don't know if you can see it because I'm on a very large screen, and this is a pretty small text, but what we have is at home with a change of 15% is actually ranked higher than dinner, which is a change of 89%. And the reason for that is people talking about drinking coffee at home is a much more stable conversation. So a 15% change is more significant, whereas people talking about coffee at dinner, much more volatile, less volume overall, so it's much more volatile. And that's why we're going to be seeing actually an 89% change being considered less important. And that's a key impact of trying to look at this from a true scientific perspective. All of these are clickable, so I can click in and find out what are people saying about at home, and see that contextual report that comes up, and it'll show us some information, show us those volumes, what are some co-mentioned topics. So when we're people talking at home, they're also talking about breakfast, what else is correlated to it, and they're also talking about instant coffee. we're already starting to get a shape of the conversation, how people are talking about being at home. Some of it is not that surprising necessarily, but it's good to confirm our understanding sometimes. In addition to this trends landscape, we have a few other capabilities that I want to highlight. I already showed you that shift with filter coffee, so I'll just skip right over it and talk about two very important things. Oftentimes we see conversations and things being mentioned together and separately, and it's really important to map them and understand essentially what are the drivers of overall conversation. So what I'm noticing with this heat map is we have a cluster around all of the meal times, so breakfast, lunch, and dinner, that happen to have a high correlation or a high co-mention rate with each other. And that is more or less to be expected when people are talking about time of day. They're talking about time of day and they happen to be mentioned together. But what I also notice is that breakfast at home is mentioned at a fair amount, and breakfast and coffee with friends is mentioned a fair amount. And that's not something co-mentioned, mentioned in the same document, in the same verbatim. And that's not something I expect, especially during this crisis. So I want to dig in and find out more about what's happening. I can see that people are talking about doing that at home. And what we're going to find here, and it's because I've looked into this before, it's actually people talking about what they miss. They miss having coffee with their friends. And that's something that comes up a lot when we're looking at these kinds of conversations. It's not just that people want to have an understanding or just talk about the fact that they have a coffee with friends. And it wasn't in May, we weren't into Zoom fatigue yet, where people were doing random things like that. So it's very interesting. And then we have something else in addition to co-mentions, which is when things are mentioned at the same time, which is correlations, which is when the shape of conversation evolves similarly. And this is something that's awesome to me, because now we can see what are the things that actually relate to each other in people's minds, even if, or in the world, even if they don't get mentioned together. My favorite example of this is when talking about home energy. We had a dashboard looking at home energy. So, solar power and sustainable, essentially solar power. And one thing we noticed is that there was a high co-mention rate between the Tesla home solar power and these brands. But even when there wasn't a high co-mention rate, there was a high correlation. So when people were talking about Tesla's solar power, suddenly everyone was talking about everything else. And then we can dive in and find out again more about why are instant, in this case, instant and filter coffee being mentioned together. So you can see these curves are very similar. Despite having different volumes, the curves are very similar, and it means something. And actually, the thing it means is people are starting to associate the two together and make something called Dalgona coffee, which I had no idea about until I built this dashboard and started looking at the data. And so I can dive in and find out more about those mentions. Dalgona coffee is a whipped coffee from South Korea. I can see what's happening here, what this person is talking about. They have a recipe, and I can also see those engagements, that those interactions that Mark was talking about as well. So it's a really handy way to understand the world when you're looking at things through all of these different lenses, and you're still looking at the same data. So you can't always do more slicing and dicing of survey data, but you can here, because there's so many different ways to slice and dice. Another thing that's useful, especially when talking about certain types of conversations, is seasonality. So breakfast is sort of or weekly distribution. Breakfast is sort of sustained throughout the week, but when people are talking about artisanal or coffee with friends, it really orients towards the weekdays when they miss it. So that's just a fascinating thing. We have a few more signals, but I'm sensitive to the time and I don't want to go through too much of it, but we have context and ways to look at things based on the words and where people are talking about things and where they're not. For example, obviously emojis tend to be mentioned on social networks. When people are talking about a cup of coffee, the frequency is much higher on reviews. Things like that become a really good way to conceptualize how people are thinking, because again, we want to get at the person behind the conversation. I'm not going to dive much more into these other capabilities. Engagement is just looking at how much interaction you have on aggregate topics. And media wall is does what it says on the box. It's a wall of media sorted based on how much engagement they get. What I want to do actually here, Mark, if that's okay, is pivot to another capability that really comes in handy when trying to get at what's behind what people are thinking. And that is this semantic explorer. So one of the things that has been really powerful is doing text analytics on data, and that's something that if you work with us, you're used to. We do a lot of text analytics. One of the things that's difficult about social data is not just that it's unstructured, but it's extremely unstructured. And the way people talk is extremely diverse. It's the most diverse, most unstructured data out there. And what's handy here is we can still dive in and learn about things. So I was looking at that period that was around May, and Mother's Day came up, and I can actually dive in and find out what people are talking about when it comes to coffee and Mother's Day. And they're talking about a lot of things, including things that you wouldn't expect, which have to do with COVID. And these are things that are coming out of a coffee conversation. It's not something we would expect, but it's something that's really powerful to us. And it might be something that, as Mark was saying, these unknown things that might be behind the overall conversation, this is something I can quickly dive into based on the fact that it was easily detected. So when we're talking about understanding the conversations, we also need to talk about the ways people are talking about the way people's conversations are evolving. And that is really important to explore from this perspective of topics and semantics and the conversations folks have. So if I really wanted to, I could limit this. Excuse me, let me add entity categories here. I can limit this to just product types and now see what people are talking about. Now I'm a brand. I want to know what products are actually resonating with people. We're seeing multi-cup and single cup are the big things. We're seeing espresso down the line a little bit, but it's not at the top. AeroPress is way down here. So we're seeing a lot of different things that are happening when it comes to just purely the coffee conversations. If I'm Keurig and want to get into the single cup universe, I want to know what people are saying. And what I'm seeing here is that's really interesting is people are talking about cups of coffee and whole pot and pot of coffee. There's this shift essentially in the way people are talking about their experience with coffee, where single serve makes sense when you're on the go and on the move, but when you're at home, you kind of want to have a few cups ready and waiting for you. And that's something we can really quickly dive into, once again, getting to the mentions, etc. So I just want to show you that. I know, Mark, you had did you have any questions or anything you wanted me to touch on as well, or?
Yeah, I actually just had a question come in here, VJ. An individual is asking, is this able to help us to better understand influencer activity as well?
Influencers, oh, of course, and there you go, look at that. You have influencers written right up there. Yes, absolutely. Let me just take a look at this, take a longer view. One of the things that's really important about social data is who's talking, right? So we absolutely have a view onto who's talking across all the different media types. So we can say Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, etc., as well as on, news media. We can see what sources, which subreddits are performing most well, and so on. And then what we can do with this is understand them more. So here we have a different sets of rankings. So we have this ranking based on, we have this influencer rank, which is essentially a heuristic where we take into account total followers, total number of interactions, and total number of posts. And we kind of aggregate them together. And one of the things that's unique and why it's a heuristic and not just a simple math, like a simple math problem, is that as someone gets more popular, they're inevitably going to get even more popular. So the value of an individual follower falls. So you can't just do a linear more followers equals more impact, more influential. Same is true for interactions. Trending, Lin-Manuel Miranda, for example, if he's trending, or to pick a Canadian, William Shatner, if he's trending, it's because he's super popular. So the interactions also go down in value. Despite the fact that they are actually still unpopular. So what we do is we use this heuristic model where the impact of each follower and interaction reduces over time, and then we calculate out what we call a media value, and that's the number of engagements against these posts. So you can see here, Kyle, I don't know what they posted, I can find out. Kyle posted around a few things and got a huge number of average interactions, which generates a media value, and we can actually figure out the value. And it's an aggregate kind of composite score that we can assign a dollar, pound, euro value to, and say that this person generates a lot of value. And we can see it's actually just this one post that generated most of that. Which is very interesting because it actually predates the coronavirus. So it's very interesting that this is starting to happen, but that this person was trending. But after the fact, we would notice that they probably aren't trending quite as much. So when we're looking at influencers, we can do that, and you might notice we have these tick boxes. I can actually add Kyle and let's say William Shatner, since he's our quintessential Canadian on this little view, and I can actually assign them to a list. I can create lists where I track them. So I say, oh, these people are early trend adopters, or I can say Canadian influencers, for example, and add them to this list instantly. So what that means is now I have these 3 people on my list. And they're now added, and we can then monitor the impact of that list on an ongoing basis. So now I can see how many publishers there are, how much impact they had.
Interesting. A few more questions here. So there's one here that says, are the subtopics automatically created based on conversation content or predefined? So I can answer that one insofar as that we do work to predefine what those actual conversation subtopics are. They may be related to a specific context, whether it be brand, category, could be an issue. So we work very closely to be very mindful and considerate in terms of how we create and the language we use to create those queries that we have. But one thing I do want to highlight is that one thing I've mentioned a few times in this is that things change quickly.
Yep.
The platform is nimble, and it does allow us the opportunity to adjust, adapt, change those topics and those subtopics as we move through things. So just because we set the portal up in a specific way at the outset of this, it may take on a slightly different form as we move through our business needs and objectives.
Yep, and to add to that really quickly, one of the things, and I'll actually pivot over to our brand one of the things we often do is start with a catch-all. What are all the conversations about Starbucks, all the conversations about Tim Hortons, all the conversations about Dunkin'? And then as we see things coming up using our semantic explorer, then we say, oh, menu items matters, quality and taste matters, the mobile app matters, and then break those out after the fact. And because it's dynamic, we can do that after we've already collected those mentions and add more, or slice and dice after the fact.
I have another question here. It's, I understand co-mention is dependent on mentions of 2 topics / words in the same conversation. Mm-hmm. But how is correlation calculated, and what does it represent?
Sure. Correlation is a score that is calculated on sameness of the curve. And now I am not a data scientist, so I am not going to be the best at explaining this, but we take the coefficient of every line, the slope, and we actually calculate the similarity in the shape of the curve. So for example, Mark is in Toronto. He's, I assume, a Raptors fan. I don't know. And there's also, of course, the maple leafs. You might see a very similar curve between the maple leafs and the raptors normally in a normal year because their seasons follow basically the same schedule. So you might see a very similar curve here. So there are times when a correlation doesn't mean anything. We were just seeing that the slopes have a 0.83 coefficient of similarity. 1 means identical and -1 means completely opposite, so a negative correlation. So here it's very highly correlated. In the same case, you would probably see more than 0.75 for a lot of hockey conversations versus basketball conversations. So it's just looking at the shape of conversations within those topic areas.
Yeah, and to build off of VJ's point, this is where the insight and the analytical piece is really quite important in the whole social intelligence process. Because if I am a person and I'm just looking at this data here, I might think there's something going on here for sure. But as we well know, in the research world, correlation does not equal causation necessarily, as VJ alluded to. So it's important to understand whether or not those correlations are meaningful. The human insight that's able to pick out those outputs and those insights that the portal is building and generating to deliver those and report them into activations and insights.
Yeah, and a simple example of a correlation not implying causation is Halloween conversations and US election conversations were pretty correlated over the month of October and September and October. What that means potentially is that elections are like Halloween, or Halloween leads to elections, and obviously that's not true because it's not. I mean, we know that they're unrelated, they just happen to be around the same time. So this is an input A signal, not all of the signals. And then the co-mention, as you said, is when they're actually mentioned in the same posts.
One more question here, VJ, and that is somebody was asking if there's a way to set up alerts somehow. So if there's a specific topic or something, they want us to know if they can have alerts set up.
Yeah, absolutely. We have a way to set up alerts across topics. I could get into the setup, or we could just do a separate demo at some point because we have only a minute left. Set up alerts based on volume change, based on a specific topic, based on a specific keyword. You can actually filter based on something as narrow as a single keyword or a single publisher. Anything coming from that one publisher list that matters to me the most. So yeah, it's pretty dynamic and you have multiple alerts per dashboard.
Excellent. Well, that is all the questions that we had for today.
Okay, great. If any questions come up, obviously you can feel free to reach out, everyone.
Well, thank you, VJ, and thank you, Mark, and of course, everyone for joining us today. We will be sending an email with a direct link to today's recorded presentation, so be on the lookout for that. Additionally, I want to remind you that there are some handouts in the webinar console for you to download. And of course, at any time, please reach out to us directly. That now concludes today's webinar. Have a wonderful day.